So if David's paper moves a little further on into Spicer's career, mine is sort of fixated on his encounter with Arthur Brodeur, and as well as the way that that his good friend who he moved to Boston with, Robin Blazer, is encountering that as well. There's a kind of a subtext in the talk that won't come out really until the end. I think it's titled something generic like Old English in the Berkeley Renaissance, but the subtext could actually be something like a polemic in favor of an English studies model of the English department. So in his 1967 essay, The Fire, Robin Blazer links the basic questions of his poetics to an experience of a remarkable scene of the pedagogy of Old English at mid-century. Blazer's and Spicer's encounter with Beowulf in the classroom of philologist Arthur Brodeur. Despite common narratives of the New American poetry that see Charles Olson's essay on projective verse as a point of pure origin for a lot of these poets, Blazer explains that the perennial concerns of his poetics predate his exposure to Olson. He writes, "For it is a schoolbook problem. Plato's description of the power of music over the body and the dangers of poetry in the Republic. And it was the fantastic pull of hearing Brodeur read Beowulf 100 lines a whack on a good day, which led Spicer and me to compete in our translations to bring over the heat of that story. And I am greatly moved by what is received and held with force in a poet's work, and sometimes that work promises that a great deal more will be held." Blazer's brief discussion of Beowulf references a graduate seminar on the poem that he and Spicer took together from Brodeur at the University of California, Berkeley between 1949 and 1950. It's actually kind of hard to date exactly when this seminar was. David might have a better idea, but we've talked about it for a while and can't figure it out, and I'm not sure how much it matters. And this is as Spicer was finishing his MA in Old English and Old Norse, and Blazer was finishing his MA and about to go on to go to Harvard to study library science here. As a result of this class, both poets produced largely complete translations of Beowulf and took a full year course in Germanic linguistic history afterwards. This essay, The Fire, represents Blazer's first intervention in the formal discourses of the theory of poetics, written in response to his friend Robert Duncan, whose 1967 contribution to the magazine Poetry Audit included an extensive critique of Blazer's translations of Nerval and admonished Blazer for not formally theorizing his poetics in print. Duncan complains that he's not bringing poetics into action as theory, This talk today can be thought of as an extended gloss on the above-quoted anecdote from The Fire, exploring how it registers a particular historical confluence of at least two academic pedagogies with Blazer's and Spicer's avant-garde sensibilities. So let's rehearse Blazer's statement again then before proceeding. He writes, "For it is a schoolbook problem. Plato's description of the power of music over the body and the dangers of poetry in the Republic. And it was the fantastic pull of hearing Brodeur read Beowulf 100 lines a whack on a good day, which led Spicer and me to compete in our translations to bring over the heat of that story. I am greatly moved by what is received and held with force in a poet's work, and sometimes that work promises that a great deal more will be held. I'd first like to note Blazer's promotion of the relative status of Beowulf in terms of its rank and function, thank you, within a literary history recognized by an American poetry avant-garde. In his book ABC of Reading, Ezra Pound, who's the sort of reigning party line in the avant-garde on the function of medieval studies in poetry at the time, Ezra Pound proposes juxtapositions of Old English and medieval Chinese verse as a precedent for his own modernist project, exemplified in his 1912 translation of the Old English elegy, The Seafarer. Pound writes, "I once got a man to start translating The Seafarer into Chinese, It came out almost directly into Chinese verse, with 2 solid ideograms in each half line. There are passages of Anglo-Saxon as good as the Seafarer, but I have not found any whole poem of the same value. Something Pound misses here, and in the prosody of his own Seafarer translation, is that Old English verse never alliterates on the last stress of its long line. And this is, of all people, W.H. Auden comments on this in an interview late in his life. He sort of rags on Pound for getting it wrong. Auden having studied at Oxford with Tolkien, Neville Coghill, and C.L. Wren, big mid-century British philologists. And so Pound's, what Old English verse does offer is not the fundamental and total balance of equally weighted lines, but instead a fundamental imbalance in a prosody that relies on the interface of poetic diction with sound in the form of alliteration and stress, a fundamental tumbling forward motion, right? You have 2 or 3 stresses in the line that alliterate and a final stress that never alliterates. So there's always some little either skid or halt or some kind of sonic or stress bulge. Is maybe abstract, but I think helpful way to think about it. The final stress always bulges out without repeated sound and propels the force of the verse and its syntax along into the next prosodical unit. Given that Beowulf's narrative plunges ahead in this manner, carried like an outboard motorboat skimming bumpy swells in lines that are by far characterized by what German philologists used to call Hackenstil, or hooked style, run-on lines of heavy enjambment with clauses often beginning in the second half line. Given this, it's no shock that in his essay How to Read, Ezra Pound equivocates on the question of Beowulf when he provides a list of what to read from the early Middle Ages. Pound prescribes as required reading the Anglo-Saxon Seafarer, I'm quoting from Pound here, and some more cursory notice of submedieval narrative, but adds that this medieval narrative, he adds, it does not so greatly matter what narrative, possibly the Beowulf, the Poema del Cid. Blazer, by contrast, marks the pull of a philologist reading Beowulf in the classroom as at least as much of a goad to write poetry as a rebellious student's desire to flout the Platonic poeophobic prohibition of the insidious powers of poetry, that magnetism and fluid deformation of a kind of Ovidian poetics. Note that it's not only the text of Beowulf that pulls Blazer, but Brodeur reading it aloud. And again, that's 100 lines a whack on a good day, said Blazer. In contrast to Pound, Blazer marks his investment in Beowulf in the study of Old English as the inauguration of a very small, yet very concrete avant-garde poetics community, as he and Spicer then compete to bring over the heat of that story. In focusing on this capacity to inaugurate community in the performance of poetics, Blazer's enthusiasm for Brodeur's reading of Beowulf reframes an ostensibly pedagogically oriented recitation in terms that recall both the function of what we now call the poetry reading in the Berkeley Renaissance and in the later and larger San Francisco Renaissance more generally, while at the same time Blazer implicitly demarcates his poetics and his social circle from other strands of the San Francisco Renaissance, for example the Beats, that might ridicule one for locating such excitement within institutional academia. The para or extra academic poetry reading at the coffee shop, the Marxist Education Center, the art gallery, someone's house, right? This sort of reading emerges in forms similar to those we know largely today in the immediate post-war period. According to critic Michael Davidson, such readings at mid-century begin to self-consciously recontextualize the poem in terms of a certain kind of social performativity. Davidson writes, "The poetic act does not stand in a specular relation to reality in such a reading, but creates a new relationship between author and reader, and ultimately between reader and reader." Such is the implication of Blazer's account of, quote, hearing Brodeur read Beowulf 100 lines a whack on a good day, which led Spicer and me to compete in our translations to bring over the heat of that story. As a formative scene of the poetry reading, as what Blazer might call a hot scene, One might expect a post-war Bay Area poet to point to what's the famous Six Gallery reading from October of 1955. This reading featured Allen Ginsberg reading Howl, as well as readings from poets Michael McClure, Gary Snyder, Philip Whalen, and they were all introduced by Kenneth Rexroth. Ironically, Spicer and Blazer were both living in Boston at the time. This is doubly ironic because Spicer had been instrumental in setting up the gallery to begin with. And in fact, a letter of Spicer's was read at the reading, asking for help in someone finding him work so that he could come home to San Francisco. Jack Spicer's fictionalized account of Jack Kerouac's, totally different world now. Jack Kerouac's fictionalized account of the evening as an attendee of the quote, birth of the San Francisco poetry renaissance in his novel The Dharma Bums, as Michael Davidson points out, certainly presents an overly unified sense of the San Francisco Renaissance in general, as well as that particular reading. Among the overly homogenizing elements of Kerouac's nonetheless still influential portrait are its implicit assumptions about which sorts of poetics get to be marked as avant-garde, or at least as hip, in their aesthetics. Kerouac's portrayal of the reading as a mad night, that's his words, a mad night, describes Ginsberg's performance of Howl in a loose syntax in order to signify the charisma of the reading. He writes, Alva Goldbook, that's Ginsberg, was wailing his poem Whale, that's his poem Howl, drunk with arms outspread, everybody was yelling go, 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 like a jam session, and old Reinhold Cacothus, that's his Rexroth character, the father of the Frisco poetry scene, was wiping his tears in gladness. However much Kerouac's account is understood to be fictionalized, it persists as a mythological formative scene of the poetry reading for the region and the period, suggesting that what gives the poem and its performance a certain kind of force is a spontaneous and charismatic mode of expression enabled by a vaguely transgressive bacchanalia, certainly not the cold rigors of philology. Yet, as I've now quoted a few times, it is in Brodeur's pronunciation of Old English verse that Blazer finds what he calls heat. So what of this claim to the heat of the story, arising in the midst of a scene of pedagogy at the confluence of the study of the history of the English language, literary criticism, and student translation? Heat becomes a technical term of Blazer's poetics as enunciated in this essay, The Fire. In a portion of the essay specifically defending his Nerval translations in light of Duncan's attacks, in particular why they should be called translations, Blazer describes translation, quote, not as an actual word-for-word crib, but the actual heat of the process which gave form to the poems. This heat is the heat of a meeting and an entanglement of human and non-human perceptual systems on the level of cosmos. Thus, Blazer argues that Beowulf is one of those poems which surprise him with, quote, what is held with force, and also as a poem that surprises him as one of these poems in which, quote, in which a great more might be held, as an active perceptual system. Implied here is a process of translation of kinetic into heat energy, which both carries and emerges from an entanglement of an inside and an outside that forms the basis of what we might recognize as a more radical and humanely ethical, as well as a more ecologically and post-humanely ethical politics. In his preface to his edition of the collected books of Jack Spicer, Blazer cites Spicer's project as a disruption of discourse determined as, quote, an agreement of logical structure that turns out to be our imposition of an order. That's a discourse that, quoting again, does not entangle us with the world, implying by contrast that Blazer is searching for a language of entanglement, a language that does not impose an anthropocentric and archaic state of order on humans or the cosmos that they inhabit. Including within the event of poesis itself, quote, the process that leads to a poem, Blazer explains the poetics that arose in part from the experience of Brodeur's classroom in terms of a series of processual translations, personal in their locality and meaning, but not determined as self-expression. He writes of these poetics, quote, this is here a problem of describing the process of inclusions, which as a man's work extends, enlarges, and must take in both earth and sky. The heat I'm after is not simply the personal heat of the meeting, the recognition, but a heat and a passion which are of the nature of existence itself. The personal, yes, but then the translation of the personal to correspond with larger and larger elements, images of earth. This is a process of inclusion, This is not self-expressive. Aesthetics here is recast in terms of a process of poetics which renders more politically tenable and non-exploitative relations to the earth possible in the first place, or as Blazer later formulates it, quote, the aesthetic as perception. What conditions this remarkable sense of radical aesthetics as a response to Beowulf, ensconcing it so in Blazer's account of his poetics in the Berkeley Renaissance? How can a scene of university pedagogy enter into this series of remarkably radical entanglements with such an implicitly nuanced poetics? Well, as I again now quoted a bunch, Blazer says these questions of his poetics belong to, quote, a schoolbook problem. And it is a historically specific schoolroom that makes all of this possible. We can presume the pedagogical scene thus looks something like this. Brodeur, by now, as David noted, a relatively aging professor, reading aloud and offering commentary either as he goes or perhaps after significant chunks of recitation of the text. And we actually can have some idea of what this would have sounded like thanks to a 33 RPM recording that Brodeur made on the occasion of his retirement from Berkeley in 1955. And I put some of this recording on my computer and left it where I was staying, heartbreakingly. It's really interesting to hear. But I'm working on, it's way out of print, it's a super rare record, and I'm working on, possibly with Eth Press, I'm trying to figure out if someone owns the rights to it, and if we can, making it available electronically and openly again, because it's a really interesting recording, both for the sake of the history of Old English studies and for Spicer. But what you would hear is a poem that's given with a serious and a particularly cadenced voice, almost breaking into song occasionally, really, really subtly. Not overly Vatic, but assigning enough gravitas to the poem for it to still be a poem whose aesthetics might feel active and intense for a contemporary audience. The content of Brodeur's classroom commentary and the nature of his assignments are also telling. And luckily, if surprisingly, we can turn to Spicer's and Blazer's archives for a rare and fascinating record of the pedagogy of Old English at mid-century, namely to Spicer's and Blazer's Beowulf translations, a lot of which David and Sean Reynolds edited for us. As David notes in his edition of of Spicer's translation, the third page of Spicer's notes record a most extraordinary assignment, referring to lines of the poem that make up what is commonly known as the Finn episode, and its analog, which is in one surviving fragment of another poem known as the Finnsburg fragment. Spicer's shaky hand records, analyze the previous passage as you would a modern poem, both as a unit in itself and as a part of the Beowulf poem. And David has some interesting things to say about this in relation to Spicer's theory of what he calls the serial poem. I'm going to focus on something a little different. What as a modern poem probably meant for Brodeur was no doubt different than for Spicer and Blazer. The idea that Beowulf carried potential to inform and bear any comparison to contemporary critical standards or contemporary literary production was quite new in the late 1940s. Brodeur turned his attention to Beowulf only in the wake of J.R.R. Tolkien's 1936 lecture, Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics, which many graduate seminars on Beowulf still treat as the dawn of modern literary Beowulf criticism. Tolkien's lecture frames Beowulf as a poem worthy of literary study, whose aesthetic merits are to be judged on terms other than the classical models or historical reliability of the poem as a representation of some Germanic antiquity, by which previous critics had found the poem faulty. Summary judgment of Tolkien may be unfair, but as critic Alan Franson explains it in terms that sound like an accusation of treason, quote, Tolkien put an end to the old historicism of those who wanted to use the poem in positivist historical ways, but without realizing it, he handed Beowulf over to the new criticism. Though by no means a new critic himself, Tolkien legitimizes Beowulf for literary study as, quote, a simple and static structure, solid and strong, his words, and by insisting that, quote, Beowulf is in fact so interesting as poetry, in places so powerful as poetry, that this quite overshadows the historical content. So if not Cleonth Brooks's well-wrought urn, this is at least a well-timbered fortress whose perfect construction is transcendent of history and time. Brodeur's art of Beowulf his 1958 monograph, which was already underway when he had Blazer and Spicer as students, would build on Tolkien's basic critical aesthetic appraisal, while at the same time attempting to fend off the coming wave of what became known as oral formulaic criticism, led by Harvard critic Francis Magoon, who argued that Old English poems were entirely traditional in content, lacking individual authors, and employing a totally formulaic mode of composition. Thus, Magoon argued modern critical methodologies, whether invested in individuality of authorship or originality of diction, failed to account for Old English poetics. Brodeur's appendices in his monograph, The Art of Beowulf, which are on the function of compound diction in Old English and related subjects, form the bedrock data of the book's opening chapters. These chapters argue that, quote, Beowulf has a marked individuality, a unique grandeur of diction and style. Brodeur, at least provisionally, is able to muster his research on compound diction into a strenuous response to Magoon's initial oral formulaic salvo. He argues that, quote, no other poem compares with Beowulf in the wealth of limiting words used in the formation of compounds. Limiting words, right? So if I wanted to make a compound about the chair and I said, I don't know, like person pole, right? In that pole is the base word and person is the limiting word. It tells you what kind of pole it is, right? So in Beowulf, Brodeur found that those limiting words are more unique than in other Old English poems. No other poem compares with Beowulf in the wealth of limiting words. The compounds denoting war, battle, most weapons, sea, hall, and treasure show a marked excess in the epic over other Old English poems. Brodeur's analysis of how compound diction works in Old English poetry is thus meticulous and even obsessive, and I'd be happy to talk more about this in detail later. The point here is that Brodeur's commitments left him in the sort of, quote, uneasy alliance with the new criticism that Anglo-Saxonist John D. Niles argues characterizes much of the critical interest in the aesthetics of Beowulf at mid-century, and maybe lingering into the late 70s occasionally. Brodeur indeed argues for the aesthetic accomplishment of the poem in terms of how well wrought it is, how diction organically contributes to a thematic whole, but only in terms of the author's individuality, an interest in the author that does not belong properly to the new critical orthodoxy. Thus, Brodeur's classroom offers a particular foothold for our two young avant-gardists in suggesting that they could borrow bits of the new criticism, but not all of it, whose experiments in translation measure how Old English diction can variously entangle itself with modern English. Recasting aesthetics in terms of the aesthetic as perception, rather than as the new critical criteria that measure self-contained unity, Blazer and Spicer take Brodeur's interest in the aesthetics of diction in radical directions, just as Brodeur before had selected and reframed the relationship of philological and new critical frameworks. Blazer translates this as with dashes not to be atoned for. Kleber has not to be atoned for with money. Spicer goes off glossary in offering simply on X people. Moreover, and this sort of tracks the whole way through. It's like they were sort of coordinating with each other in who's doing what. Moreover, building on the imbalanced aesthetics foisted upon such an already potentially segmentable lexicon of poetic compounds, Blazer and Spicer would both go on to write poems in which diction becomes the site of an imbalanced aesthetics, and I'd be happy to give examples of these later on too. This forms the basis of a translation of a section of an early Spicer poem that I did into Old English that David published in the Cutter Coley that's over there too. I'd be happy to talk about that. So Blazer and Spicer were able to retort Brodeur's unique attention to the aesthetics of Beowulfian diction away from a trajectory governed by establishment new critical assumptions, and instead allow the medieval to inform a radical alternative to the new criticism. Already in the late 40s, in a symposium for the Berkeley campus magazine Occident, Spicer had differentiated his avant-garde commitments strenuously from the theoretical assumptions of the new criticism, arguing that the new critics have taken the poem, quote, denuding it of any remaining connection to person, place, or time, the dull horror of naked, pure poetry. For Blazer to read Beowulf as a modern poem must have meant, at least in part, to be open to the possibility, or Blazer, the possibility that Beowulf will be one of those poems by which Blazer is moved by, quote, what is received and held with force in a poet's work, and which promises that a great deal more will be held. alert to a sense of Beowulf as an active perceptual system amidst the two poets, we can register the pressing excitement of a note that Spicer wrote in the margin of his Beowulf notes, even if its exact function will remain forever lost to us. He writes, Robin, the death of Hygelac. Spicer jots this down in a hasty hand, as if he needs to. I imagine him as a grad student jotting this down, maybe during class, right? Or when he's doing his translation on his own. He's encountered something he needs to remember to tell his friend and classmate something about the death of Hygelac. I don't know, but it's an event in the poem, in Beowulf, that the poem alludes to repeatedly, and which forms the basis of one of Brodur's major lines of argument about the theme of the poem in The Art of Beowulf. Finding myself in the newly privileged position of a tenure-track academic job, I find myself asking how I can help shape an English department into an unlikely place where radical poetics can flourish, even within establishment literature curriculum. And so I looked at this little note in this context that I've tried to enunciate, Robin, the death of Hygelac, as an argument on behalf of a kind of broad English studies style curriculum in which strands of linguistic history, literary criticism, and poetics can all get entangled in the classroom, next to the classroom, etc. The kind of curriculum in which a Beowulf course might shape the basic questions of an avant-garde poetics.